Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to another Tabadlab Policy Roundtable. Today we're going to be talking about the epic floods that have stricken Pakistan over the last month and a half. They've cost the country 1,700 precious lives and countless billions in both immediate requirements in terms of relief and recovery, and also in terms of what is going to come out of the post-disaster needs assessment exercise that's currently being conducted by the government of Pakistan in collaboration with the UN system, with the UNDP in the lead, and also the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. Counting the costs of damage to a country like Pakistan is an exercise Pakistanis have gotten a lot of practice with. But the uniqueness of this extreme weather event that produced this flooding has caused or initiated a number of conversations about where the burden of responsibility for dealing with this catastrophe really lies. And of course, since it happened in Pakistan, it's principally a Pakistani problem. But there's such a concept in the global discourse around climate change as loss and damage, and whose responsibility it is to address that loss and damage. So beyond mitigation and adaptation, those are the two terms that people are more familiar with. There's this concept of addressal, of actually paying into those places or those systems where the greatest impact of climate change is occurring, especially in light of the fact that most of the places where the greatest impact is are not the places where the greatest generation of this problem has come from. That's today's topic, and we have a fantastic panel joining us today. We have Ali Tawqir Sheikh. Ali is a very, very old friend and one of my first bosses. We worked together at the Leadership for Environment and Development in the 90s, and we followed each other's careers since then. He is one of the leading voices on climate change for Pakistan. We're also honored to welcome Ineza Grace, a climate activist and the co-founder of Loss and Damage Youth Coalition. Ineza works out of Rwanda and is known widely for her activism for climate justice. There's a lot more I could say about her credentials, but I think I want to get to the actual conversation, and a lot of that is going to come out from the actual process of asking questions and poking and prodding on key issues and topics. Dr. Imran Saqib Khalid is the Director for Policy and Governance at the Worldwide Fund for Nature. As a product of Generation X, I sometimes mistake WWF for something else, but I'm glad that this is the brand that got to keep that label. Increasingly, in a country like Pakistan, the importance of organizations like the WWF is going to be greater and greater. So really happy that you're able to join us, Dr. Khalid. Ritu Bharadwaj is the principal researcher and team leader at the Governance of Risk Climate Change Group at the IIED, the International Institute for Environment and Development, another one of the key thought leadership nodes globally for how we think about issues related to the environment and to sustainability and how we tackle those issues. So it's great that she'll be part of this conversation. I think countries like Pakistan are going to need advocates and champions like Ritu in order for this country to have a fighting chance of dealing with this challenge. And that doesn't mean that others should necessarily be bailing out Pakistanis, but it does mean that a fair conversation needs to take place. Few people are as well qualified as Dr. Bharadwaj to have that conversation. So we're really honored that you're part of this. And last but definitely not least is Kashmala Kakakhil, a climate finance expert from Pakistan, who's done a whole bunch of work in terms of disaster risk reduction and the loss and damage framework under the UNFCCC. She was previously leading the Climate and Development Knowledge Network in association with LEAD. There's really nobody in Pakistan that has worked on this topic that hasn't interfaced with Ali Tokir Sheikh. But Kashmala is one of the next generation leaders on this topic, and I'm really delighted that she was able to make time for us and join this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, I am super excited to have you all. I have a habit of speaking too much, and I've already taken up 5 minutes of airtime. I'm going to start the conversation with everyone's permission with Ali Tokir Sheikh. And Sheikh Saab, I'm going to ask if you can, whenever you speak, to unmute yourself. I see that everyone is super well disciplined and is already on mute, but unmute yourself when you speak, please. Let me ask you to set this conversation up. Is this a simple matter of Pakistanis looking to make a quick buck, whether they're in government or outside government, using the excuse of these floods? Or is there some genuine reason that we should be looking to the rest of the world in terms of supporting getting us out of this catastrophe? Because it's a multi-layered, long-term and complex emergency, which I think people forget. People think that floodwater comes in and floodwater goes away. As you and many viewers as well know better, that's not what's going to happen here. So first, just this binary of whether it's all Pakistan's responsibility or whether there's some argument to be made that this is a shared global responsibility. Ali Tokir Sheikh.
Thank you, Musharraf, for such a generous introduction, and thank you for hosting us all on this important topic. This is a very important issue. And I want to go back to 1992, maybe at the Rio summit. Several principles were adopted. One important principle was shared but differentiated responsibility. At that time, the world community agreed that climate change will be a growing and a very serious threat. And those who have historical responsibility in two contexts: one, in terms of emissions, having emitted more emissions, and second, better economic per capita income, it will be their responsibility to shoulder responsibility and share responsibility with less developed countries. That principle has diluted over the years, but the climate storm is becoming perfect and more furious. The latest evidence in Pakistan is of a perfect climate storm, that gives us a reason that this may be a perfect storm, but this is not the last one. It may visit many other countries, maybe this country again, and there may be a combination of extreme events or slow onset events that will make it necessary for the world to figure out how we wish to proceed. So the world is at a crossroad. We were thinking in very linear terms. Some of my friends were saying that after economic development, we'll have age of adaptation, only to realize that even before the age of adaptation could begin in countries like Pakistan, we are now faced with another age that is loss and damage, meaning by the limits of adaptation have become very hard, and they are hitting the poor and the marginalized more than anybody else. There are two conversations happening, I must say, before I give space to others. One conversation is happening in global north, where they are saying that the energy transition should happen towards zero emission society, and they're looking at just transition within their own society. Second, a conversation is happening in the global south, whereby people like you, me, Kashmala, and others are saying that maladaptation is widespread in developing countries, poverty and vulnerability indexes is very strong, and ecosystems are collapsing. The world is on its tipping point, and it's not only the just transition in the global north, but it is also loss and damage in the developing country, which means that we need to go beyond UNFCCC framework and think more than adaptation and mitigation, think in terms of independent realm of loss and damage. Therefore, a short answer to your question is Pakistan may be in dire need, but more than Pakistan, I think the world is in dire need to find us a response, a set of responses to this global challenge that we are facing now.
Thanks, Sheikh Saab. I want to sort of take that conversation to Ritu Bharadwaj. Talk to me a little bit, or talk to us a little bit, Ritu, if you will, about whether this is going anywhere. I mean, it's all well and good for people invested in the conversation to want to move it forward, but I think Ali's sort of pointing to 1992 is really telling it. It tells us all how old I am and Ali is as compared to all you young folks, the rest of you on the panel. But B, I think it tells us how limited the progress has been. That even sort of 30 years after those initial conversations, we still really haven't even opened the door on loss and damage addressal. So are we just barking up the wrong tree, and should we just be focused internally and not worry about what the rest of the world does?
Very good question. And I'll just carry on the discussion that Ali Saab just started, saying that even within UNFCCC framework, this whole discussion around loss and damage started at the same time, almost back in 1990s. When I remember AOSIS started off with this discussion about compensatory justice around climate change, because see, whatever impact Pakistan, Bangladesh, or any country in the global south is facing, it's not their doing. And it's right now we are seeing the impact of the inaction that they had been doing for last 3 decades in terms of mitigation is why we are facing loss and damage now. Because loss and damage is happening because certain amount of heat is already trapped in the environment. We can no longer avoid these losses and damages. So it is beyond not just the limit of adaptation, but also beyond the limit of mitigation. So no matter what the global community does, even if we achieve all the targets which have been given in Paris Agreement, even still, the world is going to face loss and damage. And countries like Pakistan and many other countries in the global south would be facing this fury of climate. And just to explain, like, floods were happening in Pakistan even before. Droughts were happening in Pakistan even before. But now what we are seeing is of biblical proportion. It is beyond, it is unprecedented. It's something similar to COVID that we saw a few years back, 2 years back. But what we have to really see here is, people often blame that it's because of urbanization and because the drainage systems are not right that these loss and damages are occurring, or these floods are occurring in such a way that we are not able to cope with them. How do you cope with 1/3 of the country being under flood? So it's not Pakistan's doing that this is happening. It is the responsibility of Western world, which developed at a very astronomical rate, that we are all facing this issue now. Now, having said that, as I said, it's been happening, this discussion around compensatory justice or compensation for all the losses and damages that the country are suffering because of the inaction of developed countries. Who should be paying for it? Now, it's been in discussion for last 3 decades, but nothing has moved so far. We had 3 big milestones within UNFCCC. One, when WIM-XCOM was created in 2013, when Warsaw International Mechanism, which said that, it came out with 3 important objectives. One was around knowledge generation, around cooperation, and third was around action and support to the developing countries. Then came Paris Agreement in 2015, which really recognized loss and damage as a third pillar alongside mitigation and adaptation. But then it had its own issues, and I'll talk about it later in the panel discussion. And then 2019, it was realized that although knowledge and some action had been happening around knowledge and cooperation around loss and damage, there wasn't enough action and support being provided to the least developed countries or the developing countries. And that is when Santiago Network for Loss and Damage was created in 2019. But it didn't move beyond simple website. And countries like Pakistan, what you're suffering right now, what action and support are you getting? And it's not just humanitarian action support that we need for countries like Pakistan faced with losses and damages. It is beyond that. We need support for anticipating an impact like this. We need support for coping with it, but also recovering from it. Because our own research shows, it's and the other thing is, why just look at loss and damage because of flood? Uh, 2 years back, we had the worst locust attack in this region, a locust attack we had never experienced before in this region, and that's an unprecedented event, and that's happening because of climate change. We have had droughts of unprecedented scale and intensity in the past 3 4 years, and these are all, and it's only because some of these rapid onset events like floods are being covered by Western media that even the developed countries take a little bit of notice about such impacts happening. But there are so many other slow onset events that people don't even notice, and it acts like a slow poison to the communities in the global south. So when we talk about compensation, yes, it is a right of countries like Pakistan to demand for compensation, to demand for support in tiding over and recovering from these impacts. But we haven't met with much success. It was only in last COP26, that G77 in China, they put up this agenda that finance should be provided, new additional and separate finance should be provided for loss and damage. Again, we didn't meet with much success. There were countries like US, EU, Australia, Canada that opposed it vehemently. And that is when a Glasgow dialogue, 3-year Glasgow dialogue process was started last year, which will continue for next 3 years. The process of this Glasgow dialogue started in Bonn in June this year. But again, this is an issue which has to be discussed within the negotiation table at UNFCCC. I'm sure within the panel there are others who are expert on climate finance, so I'll want to hear from them. But this is an unprecedented impact, and it's not going to stop with one floods in Pakistan. Countries like Pakistan and others in the global south will be facing more and more of this. But the only difference, and it's not just the countries in global south are facing, even countries in global north are facing. For example, Germany faced one of the worst floods last year. But the difference between Germany and Pakistan is Germany not just recovered from it, it recovered better from it because they have the resources to build back better. But Pakistan does not have the resources. Countries like Pakistan are pushed into debt, and even when they are able to recover from one debt, they will be pushed by force faced with another climate impact. So countries like Pakistan and other least developed countries, because of climate impacts, are pushed into this perpetual recovery mode. So there's
Yeah.
no scope, or like Alisa was saying, there is no scope for looking at the sustainable development goal or any other goals, because
Sure.
climate is a new issue in the corner. So yes,
No,
that's
that was really thorough, and I really appreciate it, Dr. Bharadwaj. I wanted to bring Ineza into the conversation. Ineza, if we could get your video and audio sort of up and running, hopefully soon. There you are. So this is obviously a conversation that many of us. I think it would be fair, for example, for Kashmala and Imran and Ali to say to me, Musharraf, it's nice to see you at this conversation because you've not been part of it, right? Because somebody like me is involved in conversations about foreign policy or about education or about technology, but not really talking about these issues. And now, of course, people like me are talking about it because our country's been through this experience. Do you feel this is a moment for a wider consolidation across the global south? Do you feel like countries are talking to each other enough? Is there enough space for young people to experience this together with people of a similar demographic across the board? How distant do you feel from this conversation here in Pakistan, sitting where you are? And how has that sort of changed, if at all, over the last few weeks for you?
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me, and I really hope I'm going to be able to answer those very good and strong questions. First of all, it's a good time for the world to be discussing on loss and damage, because when the discussion started, as Dr. Ritush said, discussion started and people were aware that climate inaction is leading to loss and damage, but the global process or the global system was comfortable on not taking action, which is leading to us living in the era where loss and damage is pronounced. So as youth especially, we are the one who are going to inherit a planet that is at crisis. So a planet that is not safe for us to have a future, because loss and damage is affecting our lives on an extent that is not even able for us to understand currently, because the impact are affecting our country's economy, our food security, our gender equality, our ability to have infrastructure, mental health, food, any sector, name it, is already at risk for with loss and damage. So this is an opportunity. Like having a space to discuss is one step, and on the second part of where I see like the discussion among the global south and the global north on this matter. So for answering this one, I can lie into saying that I'm part of the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, which is a coalition of youth from the global north and the global south, aiming to come together to demand action to address loss and damage and to hold leaders accountable. So the coalition started in 2020 after some members attended the COP25 in Madrid. And we went to the discussion around loss and damage. And for our surprise, it was very clear that, first of all, our global south representation was not adequate. And secondly, youth were not in the room. And third, there was no women. So coming out of the room, we came together to understand that we as youth of today, we can shape what we are meaning as a global solidarity, because we understand that the climate loss and damage is the current injustice, and the only kind of demand we are asking, first of all, is the finance, because the finance to address loss and damage that is going to be new, accessible, and adequate that fit the need of the community is going to be the one booster to be able to protect what is already there, and also try to work better to build a resilient community. So yes, in this discussion, I will say the youth inclusion is there yet, but we are making progress. We are making progress because first, we are fully aware of where the past mistakes were made in terms of having empty promises or liking to give like promises in the future and not give concrete action right now. So we are coming together, first of all, to understand the process, but it's really hard because the youth inclusion most of the time is tokenistic, in a sense that they want young people to be there, but no one really understands what we are having to say. And on this matter, we do have a lot to say, because we are the one who are going to be incorporated to have like active solution for us to have a future. And to the fact on what is happening currently in Pakistan. So as AWC, we stand together with the community in Pakistan. As a matter of fact, on last week, on the Loss and Damage Action Day, we hold a podcast to explain and we share the story of the youth in Pakistan experiencing loss and damage currently, and articulating their demand, which, to be brief, is all around inclusive action and loss and damage finance. Thank you. I hope I answered your question. Thanks.
You did, Ineza. That was fantastic. I think, more and more it's clear to me that sort of older people like me need to get out of the way and make room for younger people. But we have a governance framework in our country. And I know that, countries like Rwanda have actually done much better than Pakistan, where it's men above the age of 70 that are making all the decisions for issues that are going to shape the next 30 years, 40 years. So, of course, may Allah give all these elderly folk a long life, but a lot of people are making resource decisions that have no bearing on their life because they're likely not going to be around to deal with the impact. Kashmala, you've had a robust series of interactions and engagements with the public sector, especially over the last 4 or 5 years. help me understand to what extent this demographic problem in our decision making is making it harder for activists and champions like yourself and Ali and Imran to have their voices heard, especially from the climate finance perspective. Because it seems to me that of all the things that we're lagging behind on, there may even be some innovations in terms of drainage and building back better and all of those things after 2010. But the one thing we haven't seen any of is financing innovation in terms of how the public sector pays to make mitigation and adaptation possible. So if we're having a struggle on that front, how are we going to credibly claim addressal when we're not really doing anything out of the box on mitigation and adaptation? And maybe I've got it all wrong, so please help us understand it better. Kashmala?
Thank you very much, Musharraf, for having me, and thank you for throwing a series of very interesting propositions my way. I agree in terms of this being an issue of the future and having people involved in the conversation, where you have the youth and the relevant people coming into the conversation as we go forward. But at the same time, I feel like the concept of climate change, like I keep telling people, is that it has many parents, yet it's an orphan. So while everybody claims to know a little bit, and everybody claims, whether it's sectoral or whether it's geographical, everybody claims to have some sense of what they want to do about it, but nobody really wants to own it at the end of the day. And I think that comes from the space of not really understanding where the solutions are. So if I were to bring the loss and damage conversation together with in the larger sort of the UN context, and the colleagues before me have mentioned very eloquently around the problems that we've had within the UN negotiations per se, because that's where you have this space to actually look for solutions at a multilateral level, and then you cascade it to your domestic needs and actions that are required. So I mean, if I sit back and really think about it in terms of what the problem has been, yes, we've been talking about 20 years, 30 years now, and Ali Tawqir Sheikh Saab took us back to 1992. The issue of loss and damage was even anchored in there, where it talks about creating an insurance structure, etc. But what we saw, and for people like us who have been following the climate finance negotiations very closely, was because the conversation on loss and damage always happened outside the climate finance negotiations. So we always looked at it as an issue where it was technical, where we needed more space to talk about it, where we now have the Santiago network framework. So people have been just continually busy around the technical side of things. Whereas the space in the climate finance area was largely taken over by the mitigation issues or the adaptation issues. So we basically said, look, we don't have space while we're fighting for financing for mitigation or adaptation. And that brings me to your question around innovation on mitigation and adaptation, in terms of that it can only happen. It's all a function of resources, right, at the end of the day. Considering that there was a fight within the climate finance space over the mitigation and the adaptation pillar, it was very difficult to allow loss and damage to also come into the larger debate where the money was being talked about. So it was largely kept out of that network. Luckily, however, we've spoken about the past, so let's sort of speak about what's coming ahead and how we need to prepare for it. So we know that we're going into COP in the next 2 to 3 months. Pakistan, as the chair of the G77, has been able to introduce an agenda item on loss and damage finances within the climate finance realm, where it's not just talking about let's look at this as an issue of as humanitarian aid or relief or all those things, but really look at the modalities and the operations of actual reconstruction or the predictable grant financing that will be triggered. There will be time-sensitive triggering that will happen. So it's not just about us looking so that in the future we create a sense and create a framework so that, unfortunately, these floods will happen in the future. Whether we like it or not, the magnitude, the scale is increasing. So should such a disaster, such a flood happen, what is the mechanism, what will trigger, and how will Pakistan be able to access countries like Pakistan be able to access the funding that has already been predetermined? At the moment, Musharraf, when you started off, you said, "Are we, Is Pakistan just using this opportunity, or is there really a problem? Well, there is really a problem. But the sad part is that at the moment, globally, given the whole climate, and you have the UNGA, then you have the COP, at this time of the year, there's a lot of interest around climate issues, and people, in a way, need poster countries. So today, this year it's Pakistan, next year it'll be another country, and the year before it was another country. So you will be in the news, and it will look like you are going to be compensated, and it will look like money will come into Pakistan, and there's this whole repatriation conversation. But 2 weeks down the line, 3 weeks down the line, unfortunately, it'll be another country and another country. So rather than looking at this as my only issue, and this is a domestic issue, and us as a country need to look at it, we need to create the space internationally for ourselves, and where the conversation is happening, as I mentioned, now that finally we've been able to connect the technical conversation on loss and damage with the financial conversation within the ambit of the political conversation that the UN is leading on, we're allowing ourselves to have a more robust conversation on the technicality and the actual money coming into these countries should a disaster happen. Now, and I absolutely agree with everyone who's been following these processes for so long that this is slow. Therefore, outside the UN, what options do you have as a country? Well, we're talking about innovation. We're talking about how do we look at these challenges. So there's this whole financial space out there. And we know COVID happened. And we know that debt was refinanced. And therefore, we do have a precedence where should a disaster happen, countries are allowed to refinance their debts. So that means we need to now try and look at, and now in the case of Pakistan, where we are facing one of the largest floods in our history, we're still, hoping someone will allow us to, look at our debt situation and repurpose some of the debt. But that shouldn't be the case. We should be talking about these things upfront, outside the UN processes, where we can where the burden actually, when it hits the country, you are able to talk outside the standard multilateral processes that are happening, which unfortunately are slow. But you also want to create a parallel stream that's all part of the larger sort of action on climate, on loss and damage as you go forward. And then the third pillar is primarily the legal one. I don't know if you want to tackle it now or as we go forward, where you want to talk about what role the International Court of Justice can play, or where the conversation with the UN International Tribunal, etc., are going. So primarily an issue that we need to tackle within the UN and also outside the UN from a legal perspective as well as a financial perspective, where there are lots of solutions, there's lots of innovation, there's lots of thinking that's happening. But I just want all of us who are now coming into this debate right now to not take this as a flavor of the month, because I saw this happen in 2010 floods and 11 and 12, where everybody wants quick solutions. You have the policymakers, you have the technical people, and then everybody just wants to sort of jump at finding a solution yesterday. But that's not how things happen. So in order to now really learn from it and really learn from where we are right now, we need to be proactive in terms of the international opportunities that we have, so that we create domestic space for ourselves to be able to come up with innovative solutions, not just for loss and damage, but also create this fiscal space for transitioning with the rest of the world when it comes to mitigation. Thank you.
That's such a thorough, sorry, I had a bit of feedback there. That's such a thorough response. I'm so grateful, Kashmala. You kind of already addressed it, but there's a great question from Anam, one of the viewers, and she says, for Kashmala and Ali, I remember discussion on loss and damage being brought to Pakistan by you almost 10 years ago. A lot of momentum was built in the region, methodologies were developed, and then it kind of fell off the map globally as well as nationally. And she asked, she would like to understand why that happened. I think you explained part of it. I want to bring Imran Khalid into the conversation, Dr. Khalid, and then maybe present that question along with what Imran has said back to Ali. And Kashmala, I do want to talk about the legal angle, so we'll come back to that as well. Dr. Khalid, all of what we've heard so far makes a great case for other countries to take seriously Pakistan's interest in things like reparation and certainly things like debt restructuring and those sorts of, like, there's clearly a moral case for this to happen. But it seems to me that even the most patriotic version of myself, and I'm nothing if not patriotic, I'm always keen on kind of making the case for Pakistan and maybe even glossing over some of Pakistan's weaknesses. But I can't seem to find a way to evade or escape the reality that I know that if there was to be, for example, debt restructuring, the way in which that extra fiscal and current account space would be used would not necessarily be to address the victims of climate change down the road, right? Forget about relief and recovery and even rehabilitation and even reconstruction. I'm talking about when we restructure debt, we're really talking about intergenerational transfer. And so the idea should be, if we do get some debt relief, the result should be that Pakistanis in the future should be less vulnerable to climate change. What kind of conversation is happening either globally or locally, Imran, that would allow us to be more confident when we make the case to our friends abroad in saying, listen, don't worry, we're not going to misuse or lose this opportunity, that in fact, if we do have, some debt restructuring or renegotiation, that the result will be a more resilient Pakistan vis-a-vis climate change. Is there any way we have that assurance, or is it all dark and gloomy, Imran?
Yeah, thank you, Musharraf, for having me be a part of this very interesting discussion, very important discussion. So let me just start off by saying that debt restructuring and loss and damage are two different things to me. Debt restructuring should definitely happen. It should happen for a variety of reasons, but let's not link it with loss and damage. That is something that the developing world, the most vulnerable countries, have been calling for the past three and a half decades, right? So just at the outset. Now, what we need to do, we need to put our own house in order. So let's talk about what was happening in the Swat River. The videos that you were seeing with the honeymoon hotel, falling apart right in the middle of the Swat River. Is that something that we can attribute to climate change, or is that a governance issue? How about people's homes within the floodplains that got devastated? Is that a governance issue, or is that a climate change issue? So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that Pakistan has a number of governance issues that it needs to address on its own. It needs to put its own house in order. Floods are part and parcel of our landscape, right? So we've experienced deaths from floods. We've experienced losses from floods even before this whole discussion around climate change started, going back to the 50s when we became independent, even before that. In fact, let me tell you that around 1909, the city of Dera Ghazi Khan was moved during the British rule because it was affected by floods. It is still getting affected by floods, and then that's because the way we tried to adapt to them, wasn't really, it wasn't as sustainable as it should have been. But what I'm trying to say here is that floods have been part and parcel of our landscape, and we need to address some of the governance issues that are there. Now, having said that, this should not disabuse us or anyone of the notion that the climate crisis has its genesis in the development that's taken place in the global north. We are at 1.2 degrees centigrade temperature rise since the 1850s, start of the industrialization, and that's primarily because of the emissions that happen in the global west. So when we say that the onus is on you to address our needs, we've got science behind us. There's this thing called climate attribution. It's a science. It's people working with models and experts and scientists working with models. And what's attribution science is saying, and it's increasingly coming through in the IPCC reports as well, that human activities cause climate change, and we can now even attribute climate change to specific events. So the heat wave that we just had, that was attributed to climate change. The flooding that happened in Pakistan, particularly in Sindh and Balochistan, where torrential rains happened, that's that can be attributed to climate change, and we can call on the global West to support us through by taking up the loss and damage issue. But what do we need to do on our own? We did not have proper early warning or forecasting systems. Our forecast for rain in Balochistan and Sindh was off by a factor of 10. We just need to have better radars. We just need to be better prepared. And once we are, and then if an extreme weather event does happen, we'd be better prepared, and hopefully we would have moved people. We would be a bit more resilient in terms of the amount of losses that we're seeing now. Having said this, and I know there are plenty of thoughts in my mind, and I'm trying to put them all out, but I don't see loss and damage having any traction at the Conference of Parties. And I'll tell you why. By 2020, there was an agreement at the Paris Agreement that by 2020, $100 billion would be put aside for the developing world to address their adaptation and mitigation needs. So let's say 50 billion for mitigation and about 50 for adaptation. It hasn't been met. It was supposed to have been met by 2020. Only $100 billion, and now we know that figure is going to go up. So imagine the loss and damage that we're facing. How is that going to materialize? It will not. At this time, the only commitment that we have is in the shape of $12 million by, I think it's Denmark.
That's right, it's Denmark. Right? Yeah, 13. I think 13, but yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So imagine, the damage assessment right now, we're thinking that's going to be at least $30 billion. How are we going to take that 12 million and where is it going to go? There are floods happening in Africa right now. There are heat waves happening in other developing countries. There are typhoons happening. How is that going to, how's that going to address our problem? So we need to call out the global West on it, but let's not put any hope in terms of what they'll be able to bring to the table at these conference parties, which to me have been an immense failure. You cannot negotiate, you cannot keep on discussing climate change and with the situation right now. It's just it's quite difficult.
I can sense your frustration, Dr. Khalid, and I think it's well founded and deeply appreciated. I think if we're not feeling the conversations we're having around these issues, we're in the wrong business. So I really deeply appreciate, and that really resonates, that sense of frustration. Dr. Apna Ali, I think one of the questions that really emerges from the conversation so far is, and I kind of already alluded to it, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot that's going to happen on the plus side. Partly it's this dynamic, and I'm going to go back to this dichotomy. Is it wrong for people to feel a little bit self-conscious about calling out the failures at home? I had somebody on Twitter this morning when I posted this. They said, Shahzad Khan the Masood. He said, what about illegal and legal mushroom growth of housing societies on agri-lands, ruthless cutting of forests, no tree plantation priorities? And there were 4 question marks. So he too is obviously feeling the same frustration we all are. These are legitimate questions, right? We go and we ask Ritu and Ineza to speak on our behalf, and we know that they will because they believe in this. But meanwhile, we do have some fundamental and foundational governance challenges here at home. With what guarantee or with what assurance can we move forward that some of these things will indeed get addressed? Or should we give up all hope? Ali? Just make sure you unmute. There you
Thank you. All of us share that frustration, but I think Kashmala is right. All of us have a part of the understanding of a very complex issue. And before we get in a circular argument, I want to cap the conversation that we had so far so that in the last round we could move a bit forward. The reason I had mentioned shared and differentiated responsibility was that principle was a unanimous principle that has been diluted last 3 decades. Now international finance is not predictable. It's recycling. It includes aid. It includes private sector. It includes double counting and so on and so forth. In other words, what means that we are back to square one, that how we are going to share the responsibility. The principle agreed was historical responsibility. Now we have started raising other questions as well. Why I'm mentioning this? I think you were very right when you spoke to Kashmala about the generational issue. Many of us may not be around, but the climate change will be around. But having said that, it is not just a generational issue, it's a racial and a colonial issue. The West was very, very dismissive of the developing country issues all along till last 2 or 3 years when disasters and fires and storms started happening in their own countries, resulting in tremendous losses. Only then, otherwise, previously the thinking was very linear that we will do mitigation, reduce the emissions slowly with the help of private sector. The faith was in capitalism that there'll be market-based solutions that will come, and you guys you focus on adaptation. Now all of a sudden we feel that adaptation, mitigation have co-benefits, and loss and damage, as my colleagues have said, that is looking at new set of issues. Those set of issues relating to loss and damage were consistently blocked. Those of us who have been involved in IPCC reports know very well that till the last edition there was no chapter on maladaptation. Till very recently, loss and damage was a big no-go area in this hugely big scientific exercise. Loss and damage expressions were not entertained there. And WIM, Warsaw Implementation Mechanism, as soon as it started taking some shape, because its mandate was to give independent mechanisms for adaptation and mitigation, but covering means of implementation for this third pillar that we're talking about. A new terminology was introduced in Glasgow Dialogue, which was an imprecise, undefined initiative, which had no milestones and no outcomes, and the purpose was to engage in the process. So in that way, loss and damage became a secular game. When we were talking about the principles of the money transfers or financial transfers to developing countries, they started engaging us into another conversation. There are several issues that are on the table. Initially, when I say it's colonial and racial, the objection was that there is no distinction between your adaptation issues and development issues, and I don't know it's adaptation or development, and you are bringing us adaptation issues to seek adaptation funds. We didn't get either of them. Then they said we cannot attribute, but now just as Imran said, that the attributive sciences have moved so far, so much that we can attribute almost on instant basis, even though there's a discrimination. We can know about specific events and their percentage of attribution to climate change much more quickly in developed countries than monsoon changes in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh or other countries. Now, what we are asking is cooperation and solidarity. They are saying C for compensation is a bad word. Don't use it. So all the developing country negotiators are under an embargo. They never utter these words because otherwise the conversation becomes very circular. We are talking about new and additional finances, and they are thinking about private sector investments and no technology term. When I refer to shared but differentiated responsibility, we had grants in mind, we had finance in mind. They had only a small percentage of concessional finance. Otherwise, it's all lending. And this is the problem here. And I want to invite Ritu and other colleagues to react to that issue. The entry point for climate responses is coming from disaster preparedness or disaster response paradigm, which means construct infrastructure. That is where the big guys, MDBs, such as World Bank and others, can bring big projects for infrastructure, whereas the adaptation and loss and damage and resilience is a small shop. We don't need loads of money, but we need loads of time. We need another governance structure whereby we can work with the communities to help them develop their resilience. The solutions offered so far are big construction dams, widening the roads and whatever, without taking time. And last 1 or 2 points that I wish to mention is the solutions offered are still very private sector oriented, such as catastrophic funds. Examples are given from the Caribbean or Pakistan or Philippines or elsewhere. Again, we are saying these are insurance mechanisms and market responses will come in. Whereas we are looking at a vulnerability that covers more than 50% of all developing country population. All of them are living in low-lying areas, in flood-prone areas, and ecosystems are on tipping point. To conclude, to move forward this discussion, I think we have to break some of these racial and colonial barriers to make sure that all of us understand that we are together in this. Today is Pakistan, tomorrow it could be some other country, and it could be a developed economy. And we have already seen that the people on the ocean fronts in the United States, oftentimes black, oftentimes poor, are on the forefront of this vulnerability. So we have to find solutions to this, and these solutions are not just on the Wall Street or in Manhattan. These solutions are poor neighborhoods of slums in Jakarta and Delhi and Calcutta and Bombay and Pakistan and elsewhere. So sorry about this little bit of a passionate plea, because I think Glasgow dialogue in some way is taking us to a circular conversation that has happened last 30 years without necessarily coming on the table and saying that, look, if you want loss and damage finance facility, is the UN Human Rights Council that can provide it, or is the International Court of Justice that can provide it, or it is some other mechanism? We need to be discussing those time-bound mechanisms that enable faster, quicker, and reliable transfer of international finance to developing countries where we need it predictably. Thank you.
You apologize for the longishness or the passion, both of which are deeply appreciated. I think we're trying to have a meaningful conversation, and we're not looking for easy sound bites. Nothing that you said is easy, right? I mean, I actually am tracking viewers, and we lost a few viewers while you were speaking, but that's okay, because to me, we need to find a way of increasing the audience. That's kind of my job, and I don't know if we'll succeed or fail. You're doing your job. So I'm saying this to everyone, is that I think, you know, the fact that people find it hard to follow this conversation is a problem we have to solve. We can't dumb down the conversation, because the conversation isn't dumb. And so I really appreciate, Ali, you breaking it down and saying, look, we're not going to get stuck with this binary. We need to go deeper and understand what happened at Glasgow. The reason I appreciate it, Dr. Bharadwaj, maybe you can weigh in on this. The reason it's especially relevant and important is because we have Cairo coming up, I think, in mid-November or early November. And to me, it feels like there's going to be a real opportunity for the global community of activists on this, from Ineza to Kashmala and from Imran to Ritu and Ali and everyone else, to help forge forward a path that Ali's talking about. Is that being too optimistic or unrealistic? You know, that's kind of a generic question. I also have a follow-up, which is really from Arif Ansar, who's watching and listening. And he says, India seems more successful on climate change. It has extensive track 2 climate dialogue with the US and UK. Any thoughts? Maybe you deal with that separately. But first, on COP27 and Cairo, are we going to see a different conversation? And what is it that we can do to support you, or you can do to support us? And by us, I don't mean just Pakistan, but the global community, to actually have that shift in conversation that Ali's talked about.
I'll actually, Ali, thank you so much for, presenting your thoughts so well. And I would just want to build on what you just mentioned, and especially, and also to build on what Imran mentioned. We have a tendency to hold our own domestic governments to account when these issues happen. But the floods in Pakistan were unprecedented. They are not kind of impacts that you can deal by having a good drainage system. Second is, as Ali was mentioning, we can talk about development only if we get a chance. Countries, developing world or least developed countries, they didn't get a chance to develop. We didn't get a chance to achieve our SDG, and we were forced with, or we were, we got another layer of climate impacts on ourselves. So we have development deficit. We have been colonized in the past. So therefore, we are suffering with development deficit. But now we are also suffering another threat multiplier of climate impacts. Now, going back to your question, what we can do. And I've recently come up with a research where we try to analyze the climate action plan, which is also in technical terms called nationally determined contribution. And countries like Pakistan should really put in strong thoughts as to how they present these loss and damage in their NDC when they submit it to UNFCCC, because that's the official channel, official mechanism by which you can put forward your demand. And when you're putting forward your demand, please be mindful that loss and damage does not just create economic losses and damage of infrastructure, lives, and so on. It creates a lot of non-economic losses and damages. And that is something which also needs to be accounted for. Our own research in Bangladesh, in Ghana, in Sundarbans area shows that every time a climate impact impacts any geography, one thing which is common is forced displacement and distress migration. You must have seen, even in Pakistan, scores of people who have been left homeless. Now, in an ideal developed world, you have such a good mechanism that you have in US or Europe. When they had COVID, immediately everyone got a very nice social safety net, a good allowance to tide over those crises. That is where it comes. Like climate finance can no longer be dealt with as separate silos. It is now a development issue. So climate finance needs to be provided for providing those social safety net or social protection to communities which are faced with floods, with heat waves, so that they can tide over that crisis. And that is development fund. You cannot draw a line saying that, oh, this is a climate, this is not adaptation, this is not mitigation. Because right now, loss and damage has really got ingrained into all the kind of impacts that we see. That limit to adaptation, it's oscillating, and it oscillates between whether you have early warning system, whether you have infrastructure, and that is not because of the country's deficit. It's because climate change has been thrust upon us, and that is something which we really need to push forth in our next COP discussion, which is from 8th of November. And that is something which G77, where Pakistan is the chair currently, and Pakistan have put that agenda. It is still there in the draft agenda for discussion, for additional finance. But countries also have to play their part in terms of clearly highlighting within their NDCs what are quantifying the loss and damage that they're suffering now and expected to face in future. What is it that they're able to do with their own resources? What is the gap, and what is it that they need from climate finance? Because unless that is clearly articulated, it will be very difficult for countries like Pakistan to make that demand in that global framework, because the global stock take is upcoming. So how do you hold these countries to account who are not paying up? I agree with Imran when he said that there was 100 billion promised, and even there we have a huge adaptation fund gap. But that does not stop us from demanding additional finance for loss and damage, because loss and damage, the nature of the impact itself is very different from the kind of impacts that you can. We recently conducted a research in India, in Odisha, and in Bangladesh, in Urijhar area, every family was displaced at least 3 to 7 times. That is not something that you can do anything through adaptation, because there's coastal erosion, there's sea level rise, their houses are going underwater. And similarly, you don't have cyclones. This time it wasn't because of cyclones. But even in Bangladesh, where they said in last time, they commended Bangladesh that they were able to save there was not a single death during cyclone because of a very good early warning system. But even then, even though the lives were saved, when those families went back, there was salination, the entire agriculture crop was destroyed, and those lands were left redundant. Like there was so much of salination that they can't do agriculture there anymore. So that's a permanent loss. So how do you can't just look at loss and damage in terms of lives lost. It is that rebuilding phase that is gone. There you can no longer reclaim that land for agriculture anymore, and that has to be quantified. And that's not their fault. It's not the fault of people who are suffering that. So, my only message to Pakistan and other countries would be, please address it in your NDC so that we can take it up in the negotiation through a formal channel.
I really appreciate it. And I think at least I hear you loud and clear, and I will follow up after this conversation as well. I think people like me that are on the periphery of the climate conversation need to be more adept at understanding and advocating for some of this. And the way you framed it is really, really brilliant. We're coming to we're going to try and wrap the conversation up a little bit. Ineza, is there an example? I mean, I also want to draw out some positive, maybe some lesson learning, maybe some examples. In terms of your own work, have you seen the advocacy begin to have an effect? I know that, for example, Rwanda is miles ahead of many developing countries in terms of the way the development conversation takes place. In terms of the NDCs in Rwanda or in other countries in your region, do you feel that there are examples we can point to where the activism and advocacy that folks like yourself have engaged in has resulted in responsiveness and been reflected in things like the NDCs from your countries?
Thank you so much. For what I could say is that advocacy is important, but having a strategic advocacy is also essential. So from my time, so I will answer this in two perspectives. So one, as a Rwandan, like in my country. So yes, my country do take very serious in how we are developing and taking to how are we doing it in a way that we're not harming our planet, and also ensuring that we are able to have a sustainable economic development for our people. But the most something that people can learn from is the fact that our community are active stakeholders. So what does that mean? It means that once a country decides a policy, let's use the NDC, so civil society are included in an active manner to give guidance and give the perspective of what is the voice of the Rwandan community on the decision that is going to be happening on the policy level. So that is something that is good, because we've been able to work with the government to address some aspect of loss and damage. So for instance, we've been able to reallocate the community that was in a prone flooding area last year, and we saved a lot of lives, even if we lost a lot of properties, but we saved a lot of lives. We are also doing rehabilitation of one of the wetland in our country, which is good in terms of protecting from flooding, but also biodiversity, but also at the same time offering a well-being of the community. So these and other example was able to be achieved because the government do listen closely with what civil society are demanding or what they need in the community, and we are engaged in taking decision with our government. So the second bit of how I can answer it is as part of Loss and Damage Risk Coalition. So there's a really powerful tool when you associate storytelling and advocacy, because especially around loss and damage, because by sharing stories, you are able to tap into that aspect that we are all interconnected, and we can all be part of a solution, but we are all also victims. So that's why ADOAC, we have a platform where we are holding stories, but our stories are being shared in a manner that we are calling for action. This is important because it allows people who are aware of the policy, who know all the different acronyms to understand what we are meaning, but also giving an opportunity for even the public, people who are not familiar with the terms, to know exactly what we want to see happening. Because at the end of the day, we want to have a same message that is going to be resonative to the community, but also to the policymakers. Having said that, I just like to add on the fact that once we are able to carry the pressure from civil society into the policy making decision spectrum, that's when we're going to have that spark, that thing that's going to help everyone be like every government, every decision, to understand that we need action, and we don't need to shy away from responsibility, because right now that is what is happening. And the true carrier of that sense of urgent action our youth, especially youth for today. That's why it also in part of the work that we do in NYC is to enhance the ability of the youth to understand this issue of loss and damage, but also to support them to in order to strategically advocate for the need to address loss and damage on their national level, but also in the international level. Just to say that also NYC is part of we have more than 400 members from more than 41 countries. So it's not only from Uganda, we have youth from all over the world. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for all the work that you do, Ineza, and for that really thorough response. Kashmala, we're going to end with you, but before we do, just to bring Imran, Khalid back into the conversation. Imran, Ineza just talked about the importance of advocacy and engaging, especially with the imagination in terms of storytelling. From what you've seen so far in the last 6-7 weeks, what are the gaps within Pakistan in terms of that aspect? So forget what government is doing, but are we telling the story even internally well enough? And what are the things that maybe WWF would like to see more of that folks like myself and others that are watching can contribute to?
Yeah, so the stories are being told. The stories are being told by a grandmother in Sindh whose house was swept away by the waters to her grandchildren. Stories are being told by a mother in Balochistan who has had to face heat waves and droughts, and she's now facing these floods. And she's telling these stories to her children. The stories are being told. If you're sitting here in Islamabad, Lahore, Karachi, and we're not hearing them, so then that's our problem. But the stories are being told by the people who are most affected. What we really need to do now is to go down to the community level and help these people by bringing in, focusing on adaptation, making them resilient, giving them the resources through which they can recover. This is something that needs to happen. Pakistan will continue to face the impacts of climate change via glacial lake outburst floods, heat waves, droughts. Our food security is going to be affected. Our planting season, that's going to be affected. It's time that we start addressing these needs. We do not have a national adaptation plan yet. It's been on the table for the past 3 or 4 years. That needs to be put together. And then we really need to go down to the district and the tehsil level, go down to the communities and work with the communities, hear them, think of them as experts who can help you, and not just as policies and plans that we can put on a piece of paper or in a PDF and, circulate it in international conferences. These should be living documents that speak to our needs and our hopes and what we really need to achieve over the next 10 years. It's time to really start working towards a more sustainable resolution to these issues, and that can only happen by going down to these communities. And yes, the stories, as I said, they're being told and they're quite painful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid. Kashmala, so if I was to bring to the conversation, and in particular, if we take on board Ali's sort of urgent call for us to kind of move the conversation forward, focus on COP27, focus on, the NDCs that Ritu sort of pointed to, then one of the key gaps that comes out of what Imran just said is that our national story, A, needs to be told better, but B, needs to contain within it the voices of the people that are actually affected by this. We're all affected by this, but people whose lives and livelihoods have been completely destroyed over the last 6 weeks or so. Are there mechanisms for our NDC, for example, to be reflecting those stories? And are you seeing enough in terms of government interest? Imran talked about the National Adaptation Plan not being ready. Should we be raising the red flag, or do you think there are things that are encouraging about how Pakistan might be preparing for COP27?
Thank you. And very quickly, so this is given the nature of the issue, which is a transboundary issue, we can't expect just a national country national government to take care of it, and we can't expect just the international community to take care of the issue. So there has to be responsibility in both ways. Yes, we can talk about governance versus is it real climate change. So within that context, everybody has a responsibility. And therefore, it's important where we put our best foot forward when we go to the COP. And like as I said earlier, Pakistan is chairing the G77, and Pakistan has, on behalf of the G77, put loss and damage finance on the agenda. Yes, we can bring the community, the voices of the communities on the table at the international level, but I'm sorry, the sad reality is that before us, there is a long line of countries. We have the LDCs, the SIDS, the Vanuatus, who've already been doing this. So we're not going to do anything new where we put up a picture of a grandmother from one province or a mother from the other, which the reality of the situation is that there are other countries who are already facing this. So by adding the voice of the communities, we'll only marginally be adding on to the larger debate that's going on in terms of we need to do something about it. I'm always, that noise has been created. Like I keep saying, that's sort of raising the awareness and talking about the issue in terms of here's a problem, now let's do something about it. Now where the let's do something about it is where we as people with some technical understanding of the issue need to work together with the relevant decision makers who are now actually going to be moving the needle within the negotiation on the actual operationalization of the financing. We can keep talking about these stories, but what's important is, where do you want to land these stories? What is it that Pakistan wants to get out of these negotiations? Like I keep talking about creating national space where you actually engage at the international negotiations so that you're able to develop economic growth, etc., all at a trajectory that you actually deserve for the people of your country. So while that space is important, where, like I said, we have our foot in the door by actually having it in the agenda, but now actually helping understand what that facility needs to look like is where people like us are contributing, and we should continue to contribute so that the actual outcome of a facility is not just a facility where, in order to just access it, it takes you 2 or 3 years. Well, a couple of the colleagues mentioned the Denmark issuing or going out and saying they're going to put 13 million into loss and damage finance. But if you really break that down, do you know where that money is primarily going? It's going to a German firm where they do insurance for some developing countries. 4 million of that is going to strategic partnership. 4 million of the other is going to strategic efforts in the negotiations, and 1 million is actually going into the CSOs that are going to be working on resilience in these countries. So when you actually break this down, it's not going in the direction it should be going. And that's exactly where, if Pakistan has the opportunity, where it's leading this block, where we should be shaping the conversation around this. And I'll just finish off by saying that action is a function of resources, yes. But at the same time, when we look at some of the sort of money that we put in our ADPs at the provincial as well as the national level, we see money going back. It lapses back because we don't know how to design the right projects to be able to spend that money. So again, another important area is where people like us need to continue to engage now, while we continue to do the international policy and creating space for ourselves to be able to not compromise on our growth trajectory, but we also look at the sort of funding that we actually allocate to resilience and all of these things, but we just lapse it just because we don't have the right imagination to even spend the money that we have ourselves, and it goes back to the overall kitty each time, and then each time it's budgeted and it goes right back because of underspending, especially on the adaptation and resilience projects. So lots of interesting avenues opening up. Yes, this is an area we've been looking at for the last 10 years or so, but the traction should not just be there for the sake of traction, where we're saying, look, here are how our communities are being impacted and we need help. No, we need to be sitting in those conversations where we are actually designing what that help should look like.
I think that there isn't a better way for us to sum up maybe and end the conversation. I'm super grateful to all 5 of you Ritu Bharadwaj, who was with us for most of the period during which we had the conversation. Ineza, Grace, you're really a credit to your country and to young people all over the world. Thank you for participating. Your responses were really, really impressive. Dr. Imran, Khalid, you keep fighting, man. Really, like personally, I think that this community, which I was a part of many years ago, thanks to Ali, but have grown distant from, I feel that I owe you more. Certainly more time and attention, and I certainly will make that effort. I think, Kashmala, your appeal for us to be bold and ambitious and sophisticated in how we think about this, that we're not just asking for help, that we want a seat at the table so that Kashmala and Ali and Imran and Ineza are in the room when we design the instruments, and in the room when the instruments are deployed. I think that's really the ambition. And I'm really grateful, Kashmala, on very short notice that you accepted this invitation. And of course, your contribution, as expected, was phenomenal. And last and definitely not least, Ali Tokir Sheikh, you are a singular sort of voice and beacon of light right now. I think everybody that's interested in this topic finds your voice to be one that is a reference point for all of us. And so it was in this conversation. So thank you for spending the time and the effort over 3 decades of investing in this and giving us, all of us, I think, some guidance and opportunity to engage with the topic. This isn't the last that we'll discuss this. As we build up to COP27, I hope that we'll be doing more of these conversations, and I'll be leaning on all of you and many others for your continued engagement and guidance. Also, great note of thanks to everyone that participated by watching live, and those that will watch this when it's not live anymore. Thanks, everyone. See you again very soon. Assalamu alaikum and Khuda Hafiz. Thanks, Ineza. Goodbye. Bye, guys. Thank you.